In this video, we'll be going over some of the worst cards from the earliest portions of Yu-Gi-Oh! This time going over cards from Magic Ruler and Pharaoh's Servant, the third and fourth sets ever released to the TCG. And starting off at number 10, we have Final Destiny. This is a spell card which has the effect where you have to discard 5 cards from your hand in order to activate it, where you gain the effect to destroy all cards on the field. Now, at first glance, the cost for the effect seems appropriate. You're destroying all the cards in the field, of course it would cost something like discarding 5 cards from your hand. However, the amount of cost for this effect is rarely actually worth the effort. If you were going second in the time period and your opponent manages to have a full established board of cards, you'll basically have to ditch your entire hand in order to get rid of it, and then have nothing to extend further, since this was a time period before graveyard effects were really a thing, and there were just other powerful staple cards you could use instead. In some of those first sets, they had cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole to just get rid of all the monsters, and they also had Giant Trunade and Harpy's Feather Duster to get rid of all the spells and traps. None of these cards have a cost associated to their full board wipe effects, so it's odd that Final Destiny, which combines these two cards, has such a drastic discard cost of 5, which is probably the highest discard cost of every card in the game, which specifies a specific amount of cards to discard. For the effect of discarding all 5 cards from your hand, only destroying all cards in the field is not good enough. This card should also allow you to special summon a monster from the graveyard afterwards, double your life point value, and then cut your opponent's life point value in half, and even then it might not be worth a 5-card discard, because outside of your first turn, it's kind of hard to fulfill the conditions of this card in the first place. Even though early Yu-Gi-Oh! Had cards like Pre-Errata Sinister Serpent to constantly refill your hand with discard fodder. However, it does have a pretty good effect if you just disregard that ridiculous cost, and there are very few cards that can even destroy everything on the field, so it's tentatively only at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Darkness Approaches. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can discard 2 cards from your hand to change one monster on the field to face down defense position without changing its battle position, and was unique in that it was one of the few cards in the game that could put a monster in face-down attack position before the card received an errata when Link monsters came out, specifically so that you couldn't use it on Link monster. However, even in the time period when it still had a unique effect, it still never saw any competitive play because the discard cost of 2 is too high. Generally, if you're having to discard cards from your hand for an effect, it better be something amazing, like being able to search any spell card from your deck, or recovering any spell from your graveyard, not a Worse Book of Moon. That's on spell speed 1. And this is another one of those early cards with a decent effect, with just too high of a cost associated for that effect. And at number 8, we have Ceremonial Bell. This is a level 3 monster with 1850 defense that has the effect where both players must keep their hands revealed. Now, this may surprise you to hear, but Ceremonial Bell is technically a floodgate. However, it has to be one of the weakest kinds of floodgates in the game. That being, your opponent just has to reveal their hand. There are certain cards in the game that require them to be revealed in the hand in order to activate their effects. So if their hand is always revealed, then they can't activate the cost of revealing the card. However, in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, there weren't very many cards with this kind of effect, and the ones that did weren't very good. So I don't think it was actually intended to be a floodgate at all, and just a way to gain information on your opponent's hand. But seeing as it has 0 attack, it's kind of hard to get this card on the field in order to activate the effect immediately, as the best way to use it is setting the card face down and hoping it survives being attacked in battle, which it should be able to do with 1850 defense, as some of the strongest monsters at the time that didn't require tribute only had around 1800 attack. But there were much better options in the game already, most of which were vanilla monsters that didn't have an effect, which was technically better than this effect monster with a bad effect, since at least they benefited from vanilla support. And the funny thing is, they also released a trap card version of this card called Respect Play. So, if all you wanted was the effect of floodgating your opponent's hand by having it constantly revealed during their turn, then you wouldn't even need to use Ceremonial Bell anyway. And at number 7, we have Curse of Fiend. This is a unique spell card which has the effect where you can change the battle position of all attack position monsters on the field to defensive position and vice versa. Additionally, these battle positions cannot be changed during the turn this card is activated, except with a card effect. So, being able to change all of your opponent's attack position monsters to defense position was not a half-bad effect in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, because usually it allowed you to destroy them by battle as most strong monsters had low defense points. And it's even a normal spell card, which means you can use it during your turn in order to set up your plays to attack over all of your opponent's monsters. Or else you would be able to if it wasn't for the last restriction on this card, which states you can only activate this card during your standby phase. Now, this is another card with a unique mechanic because you can't actually use normal spell cards during your standby phase. So, one would think that if you had this card in your hand and your standby phase is happening, you're allowed to choose to use the effect during the standby phase in order to force all of your opponent's monsters to change their battle positions, but that's not actually how it works. You need to set this card on the field first like a trap card, then wait until your next standby phase where you'll have the option to use it because for some reason the rulings of this card works in the way where it has to be on the field first in order to activate its rule-breaking effect. However, another distinction about Curse of Fiend, since it's not an actual trap card, is that if you set this card during your standby phase with something like Dust Tornado's second effect, then you can activate the card immediately because normal spell cards can be activated during the same turn that they're set. If a card says it breaks the rules of the game, then it just breaks the rules of the game. But sometimes there's extra rules to the game for cards that break the rules of the game, like in the case of Curse of Fiend, which is kind of hilarious to think about. And at number 6, we have Bombardment Beetle. This is a level 2 flip effect insect type monster, which has the effect that when it's flipped face up, you can pick up and see one face down defense position monster your opponent controls, and if it's an effect monster, the card is destroyed. But if it's not, then it's returned to its original position and nothing happens. So basically, this card destroys a face down monster on the field when it's flipped face up, which means it's a straight up downgrade to a card like Maneater Bug, which is also a level 2 insect type monster with a flip effect, but at least Maneater Bug can destroy a monster regardless of its battle position. And the reason I mention Maneater Bug is because Maneater Bug was released in the first set of Yu-Gi-Oh! And didn't really see much competitive play. And for some reason, they thought to release another Maneater Bug with just a worse effect that surprisingly didn't see any competitive play at all, because even Maneater Bug wasn't that great. And at number 5, we have Deep Sea Warrior. This is a level 5 monster with 1600 attack, which has the effect where, as long as the Umi field spell is face up on the field, this monster is unaffected by spell card effects, which hilariously enough means it's immune to the beneficial effects of the various Umi spell cards. However, the original Umi spell card didn't provide an attack boost anyway, since Deep Sea Warrior is a warrior type, so this didn't matter very much for the early days of the game. And there were some pretty powerful spell effects where having immunity to their effects was beneficial, like Raigeki, Dark Hole, or even Fissure. However, Deep Sea Warrior is a level 5 monster, which means it requires 1 tribute for its summon. And at the time, the power level of level 4 monsters was around 1800, which means it couldn't compete with non-tribute summon monsters in terms of attack power, which meant its spell immunity was kind of useless, because it could just be destroyed by pretty much any competitive monster in the game at the time, since the absolute lowest attack power of usable level 5 monsters was 1900, as seen with Air Knight Parshath, which saw tons of competitive play because it actually had a good effect while having a 1900 attack body in a level 5 monster. There was another level 5 monster release called the Legendary Fisherman, which also had spell immunity while Umi was face up on the field, but it also had protection for monsters as it couldn't be targeted for attacks, where your opponent could just attack you directly if it was the only card you controlled. And the Legendary Fisherman had a higher than 1800 attack, so could actually compete with cards like Law Jin, but still wasn't used because it was way too weak of a monster for requiring a specific spell card on the field, and requiring a tribute for its summon. And the Legendary Fisherman and Deep Sea Warrior were released in the same set. So if the better version of Deep Sea Warrior didn't see any play, it's probably easy to guess that Deep Sea Warrior didn't see any competitive play as well. And at number 4, we have Performance of the Sword. This is a level 6 ritual monster, which doesn't have an effect, and simply has the normal ritual summoning mechanic, where you need to use its specific spell card in order to tribute monsters from your hand or field that equal or exceed its level in order to bring it out from your hand. And this in of itself is why the card is bad, because early ritual monsters were inherently clunky by requiring 2 specific cards in your hand in order to bring them out, as well as requiring tributes on top of that, where you have to go at least -2 to bring out Performance of the Sword from your hand, assuming you had all the combo pieces to do it in the first place. And for going -2, only having 1950 attack is not really worth the effort. This is not the same as something like Darkness Approaches, which also requires a similar amount of card disadvantage in order to use the effect, because at least Darkness Approaches allows you to use any 2 cards as discard, whereas you need to have 2 specific cards in your hand to perform the ritual summon Performance of the Sword. There were 3 other ritual monsters released alongside Performance of the Sword, that being Hungry Burger, Crab Turtle, and Relinquished. Of them, only Relinquished has an actual effect, and it's a pretty good effect too. The other ones are all also equally terrible along the same veins as Performance of the Sword, and never saw any competitive play. Because rituals as a mechanic are so inherently bad that the only way to make them playable is to just actually make them broken, as seen with the Necros and Drytrot archetypes. And at number 3, we have Solomon's Logbook. This is a trap card which simply has the effect to skip your next standby phase. Now, as we all remember, the standby phase is that short phase which happens after you draw a card and before your main phase 1, and generally exists as a way for card effects to activate that you can't really interact with meaningfully outside of quick effects. Think of cards like Treeborn Frog which come back during the standby phase. However, there is another thing that happens during the standby phase pretty regularly, and that's paying the cost for certain effects that are continuous. Around the same time Solomon's Logbook came out, they also released a card called Imperial Order, which negated all spell effects on the field but required you to pay 700 life points during each of your standby phases. So I would assume the intended synergy of Solomon's Logbook was to be able to skirt the cost of certain effects. Maybe something even big like Mirror Wall, which had a 2,000 life point cost during your standby phase. Or even later on with Mirage of Nightmare, which would discard up to 4 cards from your hand during your standby phase. There are some cards which can benefit from having your standby phase skipped, and even with those cards, you still probably wouldn't want to play Solomon's Logbook, because that's all it does, and avoiding cost of certain effects is not that big a deal. Especially not a trap card that has to exist in the field for a full turn before you're able to use it. This card kind of falls into those categories where technically it's a useful effect, but it's just not a very good one, and it's a technically good effect that requires synergy for it to do anything at all, and even then, the most useful applications of the things you can do with this is to simply avoid paying costs, which are generally not a big deal, unless it's attached to something like Mirage of Nightmare, which is currently banned. And at number 2, we have Wall Shadow. This is a level 7 monster with no effect that only has a summoning condition where it can only be special summoned with the effect of Magical Labyrinth first. Magical Labyrinth is an equipped spell card which can only be equipped to Labyrinth Wall. And Labyrinth Wall is a level 5 normal monster with 3000 defense, so it requires a tribute in order to get on the field. However, Labyrinth Wall has 0 attack. So if you equip Labyrinth Wall with Magical Labyrinth, then you can special summon out Wall Shadow from your deck, which gives you a grand total of 1600 attack points with no meaningful effect, and thus pretty bad. Remember how we talked about Deep Sea Warrior being kinda bad for a level 5 monster with 1600 attack? Well, Wall Shadow is much harder to bring out, because one of the combo pieces required also requires a tribute summon. And if all you want is a 3000 defense monster, you can just kind of leave Labyrinth Wall in the field instead for much less effort. And also, bringing out Wall Shadow requires you to play specific cards, which is incredibly difficult to get on the field and activate in the first place. A lot of early Yu-Gi-Oh! Required incredibly specific cards to interact with each other without real ways to search them out. So no one played those cards because they were so ridiculously inefficient to. And there was really no reason to play Wall Shadow anyway, unless you were to combo with something like Spike Shield with Chain, so it could gain 1600 defense boost if it's tacked. Or maybe even Magnum Shield, since it's technically a warrior type monster, which can increase its attack by its defense. So Magnum Shield can give the wall a 3000 attack boost, which is significant for an equipped spell card. But both of these cards are released over 10 years after Wall Shadow was. So if you really want to make the best use of Wall Shadow for some kind of gimmicky deck, Magnum Shield is definitely the way to go, which was just not a thing when this card first came out. And at number 1, we have Drill Bug. This is a level 2 monster with 1100 attack, which is actually kind of high for a level 2 monster, where it has the effect that if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can select a specific card named Parasite from your deck, and then place that card on top of your deck. So basically it's a searcher for Parasite, but it doesn't even add the card to your hand, and requires it to inflict damage first. Normally a searcher just adds the card from your deck to your hand on their summon, or that's how it became normal later on in Yu-Gi-Oh! Likely Drillbug was one of the first archetype searches in the game, which could explain why it did its search very poorly. And the card it searched out, Parasite, wasn't even that good either. As what it did was have the effect that if it was flipped face up and survived the battle, you could then add this card to your opponent's deck face up. Where if your opponent drew the card, then it would special summon itself immediately, inflict 1000 points of damage to its controller, and then turn all the monsters the player controlled into insect type monsters. So a synergy could be stated that if you give Drillbug to your opponent after you set up your opponent with Parasite, then attack into Drillbug with a low attack monster you control to inflict damage, forcing your opponent to search out Parasite to put on top of their deck, this could be a convoluted way of getting the intended purpose of searching the card out for your opponent. Maybe, because Drillbug's effect is optional, so they can just choose not to do that. 2 years later, they would release a support card for Parasite called Jade Insect Whistle, which simply forces your opponent to search out one insect-type monster and then place that card on top of their deck, which still doesn't really solve the problem of Parasite not being very good for all the effort it requires in order to set up and use properly, something that wasn't solved until Duel Links came out, where there was literally a skill that just added the cards to your opponent's deck at the start of the duel, rendering Drill Bug completely useless, and Parasite actually useful, even though it wasn't super useful beforehand. I will say, Jade Insect Whistle absolutely saw play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links because that 1000 life point burn was actually a bigger deal when your life points only started off at 4000, rather than normal Yu-Gi-Oh! Where 1000 life point burn is not worth the effort. If Parasite did double the amount of damage, it still wouldn't be worth the effort to activate for its burn damage alone, outside of using a skill to auto-include it into your opponent's deck. Alright, and that's the list. As always, if you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. Most likely I'll make another video in this series covering some more of the early bad cards.